I want you to picture a place where courage is not the problem. Peleliu was not short on brave men. It was short on options. Coral ridges sliced the island into jagged shelves sharp enough to shred boots and knees, white enough to reflect heat like a mirror aimed at the sun. By mid-morning, the temperature pushed past 100 degrees, and the ground itself seemed hostile, as if the island had chosen a side. Marines did not fall here because they hesitated. They fell because there was nowhere to go. The American plan had assumed 4 days. That was not optimism. That was arithmetic, based on old assumptions. Bombard the beaches, land the infantry, break resistance, move inland. The problem was that the enemy had changed the equation. The Japanese commander had abandoned the dramatic charges Americans expected and replaced them with patience. Instead of dying quickly, his men planned to make the Americans die slowly. The island was wrapped in concrete. Pillboxes were carved directly into coral ridges, not placed on top of them, but fused with the rock itself. Each bunker covered the approaches to the next overlapping fields of fire, like crossed fingers waiting to snap shut. Concrete walls were thick enough to laugh at rifle rounds. Inside tunnels stitched the positions together, allowing defenders to vanish, reappear, reinforce, and counterattack without ever exposing themselves to the sky. Normally, this is where tanks solve the problem. Steel beats concrete. Except tanks could not climb coral ridges that rose like broken teeth. The paths were too narrow, the angles too steep, and the ground too fragile. Artillery might have helped, except the Marines were already pressed against the bunkers. Firing shells would have meant killing the men you were trying to save. Air support had already done its part and moved on. What remained was infantry rifles and distance measured in yards that felt like miles. So the line froze. Marines hugged the ground, pinned by machine guns they could not see and could not silence. Every movement drew fire. Every pause bought time for the defenders. This was not fear. This was geometry. A perfect defensive system does not need brilliance. It only needs enough coverage to make movement irrational. Somewhere inside that frozen line was Arthur Jackson. 19 years old, 3 days on the island. No confirmed kills, no reputation, no legend waiting to be born. He was not thinking about history or medals or speeches. He was thinking about the simple math unfolding in front of him. Stay here, and men keep dying. Move forward, and men might still die, but at least something changes. Jackson was not an officer. He did not have authority or a grand plan. What he had was time running out. He had watched the bunkers work exactly as designed. He had watched grenades bounce uselessly from concrete and bullets spark and ricochet like insults. He understood that bravery had already been spent. It had purchased nothing. This is the moment people like to romanticize, but romance had no place on Peleliu. There was no speech, no dramatic glance backward. There was only a young Marine staring at a defensive system that offered no opening and realizing that waiting was just another form of surrender. If a perfect system was going to break, it would not be because it was flawed. It would be because someone was forced to test it anyway. And this is where the story pauses, not to celebrate, but to measure. The defenses were intact, the guns loaded, the math unchanged. Nothing had improved except the cost of delay. The system still worked perfectly brutally and impersonally. The only variable left was the human one, a single Marine caught between certainty and collapse, about to disturb a machine that had never been challenged this way before and would not forgive it once it was touched. Nothing moved at first because nothing needed to. The Japanese guns were already doing their job, and the Marines were already pinned exactly where the system intended them to be. Time was not neutral here. Every minute bought by waiting was paid for with blood, and Jackson understood that without anyone needing to explain it. There was no radio call coming, no tank rumbling up from the rear, no artillery, miracle hiding just beyond the ridge. The menu had been checked. There were no alternatives. He did not decide to charge because he believed he could win. He decided because staying still guaranteed that others would lose. This was not bravery. It was arithmetic. Men were dying in fixed positions, and the only variable left was whether one more man would die moving instead of kneeling. If that sounds heroic in hindsight, it did not feel that way in the moment. It felt like choosing which way the math would hurt. The distance was 150 yards of open coral. Under ideal conditions, a man could sprint 15 yards per second. Under combat conditions, with uneven ground and equipment dragging at the shoulders, it was less. 10 seconds, maybe a little more. The Japanese Type 92 machine gun fired roughly 450 rounds per minute. That meant 75 rounds in the space it took to cross that ground. And that was from one gun. The pillbox had more than one. The odds were not slim. They were insulting. Jackson knew the numbers. He also knew the Browning automatic rifle in his hands was not going to punch through concrete. Fired from the hip, it was not even accurate. That was not the point. Accuracy was for later. The bar was there to shout, not to whisper, to force heads down, to buy seconds. The way a man buys time with borrowed money he never plans to repay. He did not ask permission. There was no ceremony. One moment he was pressed against the coral, the next he was upright, running the beer, chattering as he swept the firing slit with noise and dust. Bullets snapped past him close enough to convince the air itself to move aside. Coral shards jumped under his boots. If there was fear, it was busy doing something else. Halfway across the magazine ran dry. He dropped behind a rock, slammed in another, and kept moving. This was not a charge in the cinematic sense. It was a sequence of small decisions made too quickly to regret. When he reached the blind spot beside the bunker, the geometry flipped. The firing slit that had dominated the approach could no longer see him. For the first time, the system hesitated. Jackson pulled white phosphorus grenades and fed them into the opening. Fire followed air, and air followed screaming. Men stumbled out burning, and Jackson shot them, without pause, not out of hatred, but because stopping would reset the equation. Phosphorus alone would not finish the job, so he shoved the explosives through the same slit and ran. The blast erased the pillbox from the ridge, lifting concrete and bodies into the sky. When the dust settled, the first bunker was gone. More important, something else had vanished with it. The illusion of permanence. Inside the Japanese defensive network, radios crackled and assumptions broke. A position that was not supposed to fall had fallen. A system built on mutual protection had lost a piece, and systems do not like that. They react. They overcorrect. They expose seams. Jackson stood up, ears ringing, hands shaking alive in a place that had not planned for him to be. Behind him, Marines began to move. Ahead of him, 11 pillboxes were still intact. The decision had not solved the problem. It had only proven that the problem could be touched. And for a defensive system that relied on never being touched, that realization was already dangerous. The second pillbox did not fall because Jackson became stronger. It fell because the system around it became weaker. Japanese defenses on Peleliu were not designed as individual fortresses. They were designed as a network, each position borrowing strength from the next. Guns overlapped angles complemented each other, and confidence flowed along the tunnels as reliably as ammunition. As long as every pillbox existed, Every other pillbox felt protected. When the first bunker vanished, that assumption died with it. What followed was not chaos, but adjustment. And adjustment is slower than instinct. The remaining positions were built to fire outward toward the beach, toward the expected direction of American movement. They were not built to question their own geometry. With one bunker gone, gaps appeared where no one had planned for gaps to exist. Blind spots emerged not because the Japanese made mistakes, but because their design assumed perfection would hold. Jackson did not rush blindly now. He moved like a man who had just learned a dangerous secret. The second pillbox sat 80 yards away, smaller, quieter, still confident, in the angles it had rehearsed for weeks. Jackson approached from the flank, using coral ridges that blocked the firing slits. The gunners inside could hear him, but could not see him, a deeply unsettling situation for men trained to trust visibility. Grenades were thrown blindly, exploding against empty rock, while Jackson closed the distance. This bunker had ventilation shafts, narrow openings meant to carry heat and fumes away from the interior. They were safety features, not weaknesses until someone treated them like doorways. Jackson climbed onto the roof, found the opening, and fed rifle fire into the darkness below. Concrete turned the rounds into ricochets. Inside the bunker, bullets bounced where men stood. When the firing stopped, the second position went silent. The system lost another node. By the time Jackson moved on to the third and fourth pillboxes, the fight had changed character. These positions were paired, designed to protect each other, each covering the other's approach. On paper, this was elegant. In practice, the removal of nearby bunkers created a narrow corridor between their firing arcs. It was not wide. It was not forgiving. But it existed, and existence was enough. Jackson ran that corridor without hesitation. Speed mattered more than precision. He reached one bunker, fired into its slit, threw his remaining grenade, then crossed to the second before the defenders could reorient. What looked like reckless movement was actually geometry exploited under pressure. The system was still powerful, but it was no longer coherent. As these positions fell, something else began to happen. Marines who had been pinned for hours started to move. Not because orders changed, but because space appeared. A defensive network does not need to be destroyed everywhere. It only needs to lose rhythm. Once fire no longer arrived from expected angles, men stood up. Once men stood up, momentum returned. From the Japanese perspective, the problem grew invisible before it grew fatal. Reports moved through tunnels and radios, but they described effects without causes. A pillbox lost here, another silent there. No clear front, no clear threat, only the unsettling knowledge that the system was reacting instead of controlling. Defensive doctrine depends on predictability. Once predictability erodes, even intact positions begin to feel isolated. Jackson was still one man, but he was no longer the story. The story had become the failure of synchronization. Each bunker that fell made the next one more vulnerable, not because it was weaker, but because it was alone. The ventilation shafts that once preserved life now ended it. The overlapping fire that once guaranteed safety now left empty seams. And the Marines advancing behind Jackson were not following a hero. They were following physics. By the time 4 pillboxes were silent, the southern defenses were cracked, not shattered, but cracked deeply enough to spread. What had begun as a desperate decision had become a systems failure unfolding in real time. And systems, once they start to fail, rarely stop where you expect them to. The defenders still had weapons and concrete, but they no longer possessed the quiet confidence that once made those things decisive. The system did not collapse quietly. Systems rarely do. Once the Japanese command understood that a single point of failure was unraveling their southern line, the response was immediate and disciplined. This was not a panicked rush or a suicidal charge. It was a calculated counterstroke. 40 soldiers were pulled from reserve and pushed through the tunnel network with one purpose: seal the breach, eliminate the cause, restore the geometry that had kept Americans pinned for days. Jackson did not know this was coming. What he knew was simpler and more dangerous. He was running out of everything. Ammunition was gone faster than fear. Grenades had been spent on concrete mouths that refused to stay silent. His bar was hot enough to punish careless hands, and the magazines were empty enough to feel heavier than full ones ever had. The system was cracking, but the man breaking it was approaching his own limit. He scavenged the battlefield with the efficiency of someone who understood time was not on his side. Japanese rifles used different ammunition useless to him. A small irony that would have been funny if it were not so deadly. Grenades, however, were universal in their intentions. He collected what he could from the fallen, counting them like coins in a pocket that was already too light. He found a discarded rifle, stripped ammunition by hand, and loaded rounds one by one into empty magazines. It was slow, tedious work, the kind that feels absurd in the middle of chaos, but absurdity was better than helplessness. When the counterattack came, it did not announce itself. The Japanese emerged from the coral and formation rifles, up moving with purpose instead of noise. This was the system trying to correct itself. Jackson took cover and fired in short bursts, 5 rounds at a time, pausing not for drama, but for discipline. Every bullet now mattered. Waste was no longer an option. The first Marines to see the movement joined the fight instinctively. Rifles cracked, clips pinged. A bar jammed and was cleared with hands that shook only slightly. The engagement tightened into something smaller and sharper. 4 Americans, limited ammunition against a force that still believed numbers could solve the problem. For a moment, the math swung back against Jackson. 60 rounds between them, 25 soldiers still advancing, and no guarantee that help would arrive in time. This was the fragile moment no victory montage ever shows. The point where success is thin enough to tear. Jackson reloaded his last magazine and braced the rifle against coral, firing with care that bordered on reverence. He was no longer forcing heads down. He was choosing targets. The Japanese advanced anyway, disciplined, stubborn, convinced that restoring the line was still possible. Then the ground behind them erupted. Marines had pushed through the gaps created earlier, using the same broken geometry that had undone the bunkers. 40 men appeared where the Japanese did not expect them, rifles and grenades filling the space the system could no longer cover. The counterattack found itself caught between 2 pressures, and the correction became a catastrophe. In minutes, it was over. Bodies lay where the plan had failed. The reserve was gone, spent in an attempt to restore a machine that no longer functioned as designed. The southern perimeter was now exposed in a way no amount of discipline could immediately fix. Jackson stood there, breathing hard, not triumphant, just aware that the ground under his feet had shifted again. Ammunition was suddenly available. Marines were everywhere. Orders began to move forward instead of backward. The system had reacted violently, and in doing so, it had exhausted its last clean response. The irony was impossible to ignore. The more force the defense applied to correct itself, the more it revealed how compromised it had become. Jackson had not destroyed the system by overpowering it. He had forced it to spend resources it could not replace fast enough. The victory, if it could be called that, felt thin. It depended on timing, on exhaustion, on a margin so narrow it barely existed. And as Marines reorganized and looked toward the remaining pillboxes, it became clear that this was not the end. The line had bent, cracked, and recoiled. What came next would decide whether it finally broke or whether the system would find one last way to hurt everyone who thought it was already dead. The final defensive line did not look dramatic from a distance. It was not taller, louder, or more impressive than what had already fallen. What made it dangerous was its shape. 3 pillboxes arranged in a tight triangle, each covering the approaches to the others, each designed to punish hesitation. This was the system at its most refined, the point where theory and terrain finally agreed. If anything was going to stop the collapse, it would be here. There was no heavy support left to call in. Naval guns had shifted elsewhere. Aircraft were committed beyond the ridges. Mortars could not fire without risking the Marines already moving forward. The options had narrowed again, but this time the narrowing worked against the defense. The system needed time to reset, and time was no longer available. Jackson moved with the Marines now, not ahead of them, not behind them. The triangle demanded simultaneity. One position could not be taken alone without exposing the attackers to the other 2. So the decision was made quickly and without ceremony. 3 groups, 3 approaches, 1 moment. If they moved together, the triangle would lose its meaning. The run across open ground was shorter this time, but the cost was immediate. Gunfire erupted as soon as the Marines cleared cover. 2 men fell within seconds. No one stopped. Stopping was what the system expected. Jackson reached the wall of the central pillbox and pressed against the concrete, counting without thinking. He threw a grenade through the firing slit, waited, then threw another. 1 gun fell silent. The second kept firing, stubborn and efficient. He climbed to the roof and found the ventilation opening by touch more than sight. The rifle went in. The magazine emptied. Sound inside the bunker changed, then disappeared. The center position was finished. On one flank, a satchel charge collapsed a roof. On the other, the fight dragged longer than planned. Grenades came back out faster than the Marines could close in. Jackson ran again. The bullet that caught his leg was not dramatic. It did not spin him or throw him to the ground. It simply cut and kept going, an efficient reminder that the body keeps its own accounts. He did not stop. Stopping would have allowed the triangle to breathe, and breathing was all the system needed to recover. The third pillbox fell. Moments later, its defenders silenced from above. The triangle was gone. What remained were isolated positions no longer able to protect each other. The theory that had made them strong now worked against them. Mutual support only functions when everyone is still alive. Blood soaked Jackson's trousers. Someone tried to pull him back. He shook them off. Not because he wanted to be brave, but because the arithmetic was still unfinished. 3 pillboxes remained, and every one of them could still kill men moving through open ground. If the pressure eased, the defense would stiffen again. Systems recover when you give them space. The 10th position fell to grenades dropped through a shaft that had never been meant for enemies. The 11th required help. Jackson's weapon was empty again, and another Marine stepped forward with explosives. They worked together without discussion, the way people do when talking would slow things down. The final pillbox sat on a small rise overlooking the beach. It had been firing since the first landings, quietly, persistently doing its job. Its commander knew what was coming. Everyone did. Jackson approached more slowly now, his leg unsteady, his vision narrowing at the edges. 3 Marines stayed with him, not because they were ordered to, but because leaving him alone felt wrong. Fire met them at a distance. Suppression answered it. The flamethrower moved forward, heavy and awkward, effective, only if it survived long enough to matter. Jackson covered the advance, dropping to one knee when his leg gave out, standing again because staying down would have ended everything. The flame arced into the opening. The last pillbox went silent. Not with an explosion, not with spectacle, but with absence. The southern line was finished. What had fallen was not concrete. It was an idea. The idea that perfect structure guarantees safety. The pillboxes had not failed because they were weak. They failed because they were rigid. Once the assumptions behind them broke, the collapse followed naturally. Jackson did not defeat the system by strength. He defeated it by forcing it to operate outside the conditions it required to exist. When the firing stopped, there was no celebration, only movement forward into ground that no longer pushed back. The defenders were gone, the geometry undone, and the cost written plainly on bodies and burned coral. The line had not been conquered. It had simply reached its final limit and could not continue. When the firing stopped, no one cheered. There was no line of men raising rifles, no moment that felt like an ending. The island was still hot, still loud, with distant gunfire, still indifferent. Jackson collapsed against the coral and let gravity finish what adrenaline no longer could. Medics reached him quickly, cutting away blood-soaked fabric, working with calm hands that suggested this scene was ordinary, because to them it was. The wound would heal. The limp would stay. That exchange was never negotiated. Within days, while the island was still being fought over ridge by ridge, Jackson was back on his feet, moving slower, saying little, and doing his job. Word of what he had done spread faster than he did. Officers wrote reports. Numbers were counted. Pillboxes were listed as if they were inventory, instead of places where men had lived and died. Eventually, paperwork reached the highest desks. A medal followed. There were photographs, handshakes, a short speech, and a piece of metal placed around a young man's neck. It was meant to represent courage. It also represented closure, which was convenient because wars prefer neat endings. Jackson stood where he was told, listened to words chosen carefully, and did not correct anyone. After the war, the story narrowed. He went home, he married, he worked. He walked with a limp that strangers noticed and friends learned not to mention. He did not talk about Peleliu, not because he was modest, but because memory does not improve when shared too often. He lived a long time carrying events that had taken less than 2 hours. When he did speak later in life, it was never the story people expected. He did not describe heroism. He described exhaustion. He described fear behaving like a tool instead of an enemy. He described systems, how they fail, and how people get caught inside them. Students listened, veterans nodded, and everyone eventually realized that the medal explained very little. There is a temptation to end stories like this with meaning, to claim that sacrifice produces clarity, or that violence reveals truth. Jackson's life suggests otherwise. The war did not turn him into a hero. It turned him into someone who knew exactly how thin the line is between function and collapse. He survived because the system around him failed before he did. That is the quiet ending. No swelling music, no final charge. Just a man who outlived the day that defined him, carried its weight for decades, and never mistook survival for glory. War does not create heroes. It creates survivors, and then leaves them to explain why they are still here. It is an ending without applause, without lessons neatly wrapped, without promises that suffering was necessary, useful, or redemptive. Only the simple fact that some people endure events they would never choose and spend the rest of their lives quietly accounting for the cost, long after the noise fades and history turns the page for everyone involved.